Hello and welcome to Ivory Blush Roses. My name is Lisa and today we're on episode 9 of the Rickrack Sampler. We have 5 pieces of rickrack left and we're going to be using Cretan and Chevron stitch to fill these in. I have so many ideas I could keep going, but the sampler is going to be full after this. So let's go ahead and get started with our stitching today. Same supplies that I've been using. I also have included my little OmniGrid quilting ruler because I think it's often very helpful. But if you want to see a full list of the supplies, look back at the first 7 videos because they have much more in-depth coverage on that. In the very first video, we did a Cretan stitch. And in this one, we stitched it completely coming off of the valleys of the rickrack. This time, we're going to stitch it on the rickrack, but off of the peaks. To try and keep my pattern, I'm going to come up in the middle at the end of that piece of rickrack. I'm going to come up on top of this, 1/4 inch above it, but this time when I bring it back, I'm going to come up through the point of the rickrack. And I just pulled that right out of the basting. So there's my first stitch, and the second one I'm going to repeat, but on the opposite side. So I'm holding my rickrack. I'm going to make sure I come up under that thread because our pattern is determined by catching that thread. We're following the points of the rickrack this time instead of the valleys. And we're stitching, and I didn't catch it, so all I have to do, loosen that up a smidgen, come back underneath it, and now I can pull my tension. We'll try doing it stab stitching. See if that works any easier for me. Make sure I'm catching that thread. And when I'm doing this, I try to keep the tops of the legs that come over, try to keep those as even as possible, and the bottoms as well. In and catch that. So this one again, because we're on it and following the pattern of the rickrack, it's really emphasizing that pattern. End of my rickrack. That's one of those things that if you have it stitched down in a seam, you're not going to notice. We're just going to go down in the middle of that and finish the pattern off. It really ends in the middle. It's not that off. There's that. We were able to use up most of that thread, which is great. So there we have Cretan stitch done on the peaks rather than in the valleys. Now the next one, I want to do it so that it sits partially off of that. And so let's start another one. I think I'm going to start this one here in the valley because this time we're going to come up and make our top stitch. Oh, I got to think about this here a minute. Well, I'm doing this one backwards. So this one, I'm going to still go through the tip of the rickrack here. That last stitch should really have gone the other way. And I don't really quite have as much room as I would like. But we're going to sit this so that it's going from down to the valley, coming back up through the peak. And then we're going to sit this little leg up completely up above. Normally, if it was me on a crazy quilt project, I'd like to have that sitting a little higher. But because of the logistics of how close together everything is here, I can't quite do that. So I'm just barely coming up in the corner of that rickrack trying to catch it. And you can see then how it sits above. Well, yeah, that's right. I just didn't catch my thread. And now we're going to go here. Yep, catch my thread. Bottom. There Rickrack, even though it's basted down, still wants to move quite a bit. And I stitched through my thread. Can you see that there? So I'm going to try and just go right back out the same hole. Thank you. I got that. That's good. Sometimes when that happens, you have to unthread your needle. Catch that thread. If this is any easier turning it. I definitely prefer scoop stitching this one. But that's a little harder when you're trying to come up through that rickrack. Finding it definitely helps me to stab stitch that to get it in the right spot. Sorry if I'm making you dizzy as I turn this work back and forth over that. And I'm going to come up here and finish, just like we did at the start, up there to finish my pattern out. So Cretan stitch stitched up above the rickrack a little bit. As we've done before, there's so many other ways you could do this. I played with lots of ideas, but I thought those were some of the basic ones, and so that's good to try that. Now we're going to do some chevron variations. Now we already did two. One that goes stitch from peak to peak, that stitches completely over, and then we did one that stitched valley to valley completely over. This time I wanted to try a couple that are stitched into the rickrack. Just vary it up a little bit. So let's go ahead and start with that. The first one we're going to do, no, that's not going to work here. You know, this is one of those things I got to stop and think, where exactly am I starting this at? So I'm going to actually start up here. So I'm going to do my little half back stitch. And now we're going to come just barely below the valley with our straight stitch. We're going to come back up a little bit. We're going to put the cap on. And I'm stab stitching this because it's really hard with the rickrack to scoop stitch this one. And I'm going to come back up in that same stitch here. And now we're going to go up here, and I'm going to be stitching just above the rickrack here. Put a little cap on the peak, and then we're going to come down, make our straight stitch, put our little cap or foundation on the bottom side. Trying to come up right in the same spot I went down, and now we're up, putting a cap on the peak, not through the rickrack. This is another of those stitches that connects one side of the rickrack to your project. Depending on your project, may want to connect the other side as well. And you can imagine if you did that back to back, you're going to zigzag right along with it and outline it. Always a hard time figuring out where to come up. When I shared my rickrack sampler project with the ladies in my Crazy Club group, one of them was inspired to create her own rickrack sampler. She gave me permission to share her Christmas-inspired sampler with you. I love how it's turning out. So creative. Stitch kind of got underneath the rickrack there. I find when I'm stab stitching, I need to bring that bottom back stitch over a little farther, because if I don't, it tends to look a little short on one side. because my thread's going to come here, so I have to come out a little beyond that thread. And right now it looks long, but watch, when we stitch that, it looks the right length. And you can tell this one here, I didn't do that, and so it looks a little short on that side. So there's chevron stitched on one edge of the rickrack. Again, it kind of emphasizes that. I like that variation. Two more. So this one we're going to do a similar idea. I just realized I'd worked that whole one upside down, which is fine. It doesn't really matter. So let's just keep coming down. I need one that's got a little more space, and I think that's this one for the last one. So let's do this. I'm going to continue working this one upside down just because I've got a little more space on the top, and I think that's the way I want to stitch this particular one. So we're going to follow a very similar idea to this one, but now instead of stitching on the peaks, we're going to stitch through the caps of the peaks and over the valleys. Let me make sure I'm doing this right. Okay, so there's my little cap, and now we're going to come up straight up in the valley. I don't need to catch this. This isn't our Cretan stitch. Coming back, well, and now we're going to go back to the peaks. And this one I'm actually going to stitch the cap off the end of the peak and then up to the valley. We're going to try a brief variation on this one as well when we get about halfway across, because you don't have to do every single peak of the rickrack. So there's not as much stitching in the rickrack on this one, and so it's going a little bit faster, and I can do a little bit more of that scoop stitching, which I prefer with this stitch. Again, just because I'm doing it one way, and if you find you have a different way that you're more comfortable with, that is absolutely fine. So okay. I'm going to finish this one off. Little twist. So when you get those that have that little loop in it, if you gently tug and it doesn't move, then grab that little loop, pull, and it loosens it, and you can just pull it right out. And usually it just means I need to untwist my thread a little bit. Okay, so now, because we don't need to do every single peak of this, we can change it and do every other one. So this time I'm going to put my cap over the next peak, and this gives a much broader stitch. So a little bigger cap can also help with that, both top and bottom. Again, we're going to go right over that one. I'm always trying to come up right where I went down with the other one. And now we're going to come back and just stitch over the tip since we're right at the end here and kind of do a half cap there. So having that broader one gives it a completely different look, but definitely an interesting variation. See where my rickrack is. I'm always trying to take my knot where the rickrack is because I'm working on a single layer of fabric here. And that's pretty short, so we're going to call it quits on that one. You know what, before we go on, I want to, so this is actually the right way up with this. I want to come over here and let's do that where it mirrors on the other side of it. I've got this shorter length of thread we can use, and I'm going to start just off to the side. We want just enough that we can actually see what's happening. And so now we're going to go down into our rickrack. Coming back up. Now we're going to stitch just over the top and down into. So we're really just outlining the rickrack with chevron stitch on this one. Tried to stitch through that rickrack, but I'm just pulling it right out, so we'll just call it good there. So there we go. So you can see with the regular one where it's just on one side, that could be top or bottom, and then where we've outlined both sides. And we have the broader and the more narrow And now we're going to try one that's slightly different. We're actually going to make 2 rows on this one. So this one we're going to do similar to this, but we're going to stitch off and leave our gap. And we're going to go back, and we're going in the center of the rickrack. And on this one you want to be really careful to be in the center, because we're going to be making a straight dashed line down the center of that rickrack. We want it to be straight and even as much as possible. So I'm really thinking about where's my center line on that. And if you really need to, get out your marker. I usually use the disappearing ink marker if I'm going to put a line down the middle. I'm not going to do that this time, but if I was having trouble with it, that's what I would do. And we're just going to stitch along this whole way. Now see, this stitch alone could be another variation. So maybe we'll leave half of it that way and then do the second half with the 2 or stacked variation that I wanted to do. But I'm going to stitch this one all the way to the end. I can't hold on to my needle here. And I'm trying to keep my bottom row even as well. I want that coming up nice and straight. And I'm just eyeballing it. When I get to the far end with the frame, I have a harder time stitching. So if that's the case, and I want my hand underneath, even though I'm working backwards, I can still do it. I do tend to work a little bit backwards when I do this with my back stitches for the caps, just because that's what works easier for me. So it will look slightly, no, it shouldn't look different on the back. It should still look exactly the same on the back. We'll take a look at it here in a minute when I finish. See if you can tell that it was stitched from 2 different sides. All right, now I'm not going to knot this off because we're going to come back going the other way. So let's look at it. You really can't tell the difference. Those stitches on that side got a little bit smaller, but on this side, and that's because they're going through the rickrack, and so not as much through the back. Now we're going to come and go the other way. Let me think about that a minute. I don't think that's quite where I wanted to be. Let me do that one over again. So when I come up on this one, you're not going to quite see the cap. And we're going to come up, and I'm still off here. I'm not in the right spot. Starting and stopping, it's easier to stop on a good spot than it is to start on a good spot. So you really have to think about it sometimes. We're actually going to start down here because we're going to be doing our half cap here in the space. And then we're going to come down here, and I stitched this one a little low. In fact, I might have stitched them all a little bit low. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side. In this particular one, we are zigzagging across the rickrack. Got my threads all bunched up here. Okay, so we can see that one. We're going to do a break here because I think it's going to look funny. We try to join them up. I'm coming up here. We're going to stitch these back to back with one another. And now we're going to do it the opposite way. So you get a square pattern going over the rickrack. And this is one that if I'm stitching this without rickrack, I always have to mark it because I have a hard time getting it nice and square otherwise. And this rickrack is ever so slightly uneven, so it may not come out quite as perfectly as I would like. We're just going to have to stab stitch those. So I'll do one more of those, and then we're going to leave the last couple without any stitching so you can see the other variation. There's one of those little knots. It's not pulling, so I'm going to go through my little loop, give it a tug. Usually I find if you're tugging from the fabric side rather than the needle side of the thread, it's a little better. And I do want to just sort of finish with a little half cap there. And there we have variations with chevron stitch. Okay, so let's take a look here. So here's the basic stitch we used. We took that all the way across. Then we came back, zigzagging it, just stacking it pretty much in the same position. And then here we are, stacked and giving these little square pattern. And I'm not quite perfect on that. That's one of the reasons I usually mark squares. I'm pleased with our Cretan stitch variations and then with our chevron variations. I'm really happy with how those are looking. I want to take a look at the whole sampler and see everything that we've done. There are 44 pieces of rickrack on here and countless more stitches because a lot of them we did more than one variation on a strip of rickrack. So we started with our diagonal back stitch, and then we have maidenhair, both a double and a triple. We've got herringbone, more herringbone, cretin, more herringbone, zigzag chain stitch, another variety of herringbone, fly stitch. Then we have a stacked herringbone, French knots on the points. This is a cretin stitch that follows the rickrack, a straight line of French knots. We've got cretin stitch where it's starting to sit above the rickrack, triads of French knots, and then we have 3 variations on chevron stitch, zigzag French knots, 2 variations on chevron stitch. Then we have our whipped look French knots, and here's 2 varieties of chevron, whipped back stitch, straight stitch with 2 different spacings. We have straight stitch fans done 2 different ways. We have straight stitch and with a whipped straight stitch. And then we have another variety of straight stitch that follows the rickrack that's also whipped in a slightly different manner. Pistol stitch, and then pistol stitch trefoils, as I call them. Chevron stitch, another chevron stitch. So this one valley to valley, this one peak to peak. Then we have sheaf stitch, which I really like that one. Lazy daisies, single and alternating. Lazy daisies going as though they're whipping across, so diagonal. Then we have pairs of lazy daisies, and we played with spacing, and then we tried, so these go valley to either side of the peak, and these came peak to the valley. And then we have variations on lazy daisy trefoils, so all even with a larger center and then with larger outers. Here we have a variation on a lazy daisy fly stitch. So there's the basic stitch here, and then we tried doing it with pairs of lazy daisies, then with that larger lazy daisy in the center, and then we did one that's really more of a compound stitch. In fact, this whole row is a compound stitch because it's fly and lazy daisy combined, and now we've added pistol stitches to that. Then we have buttonhole stitch, just a straight, simple buttonhole stitch. Then we have a varied buttonhole. Then we have our buttonhole fans. We have the ones that have 3 spaces and they're all detached. Then we tried with them all connected together, but these are 4-space ones. And then we did those over the peaks of the rickrack. And then we tried one which sat above the rickrack. So it's actually done just barely coming into the rickrack on the valley and peak on one side of it. Then we have, it's sort of a serpentine buttonhole because it follows the rickrack. We have straight feather stitch. Then we have the standard feather stitch. This one is straight closed feather stitch. Here's where I got messed up, and I was thinking about stitching maidenhair, and instead I stitched double and triple feather stitch. But if we put this up here, you can see the difference. There's a straighter line down the center with maidenhair. We did 3 and 2. This is true maidenhair. This is the one I use all the time. Why I got it wrong, I have no idea. And then our last one, we did feathered chain stitch or chained feather. Either way. So this is one that could fit in the chain stitch category or it could fit in the feather stitch category. So we did it with closed, then we tried it with open, and then we just tried playing with the angle of it. So there we are, all the stitches on our rickrack sampler. I actually have a whole nother page of possibilities for this, so we could do another session or 2, but I'm out of room. I filled it up to the brim. There's not another ounce of space on this sampler. What a fun journey it has been stitching on this rickrack sampler. I'm so happy with how it turned out. I couldn't be happier. Out of all of these stitches, let me know which one was your favorite in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. Have a beautiful day, happy stitching, and I'll see you in the next video.